Key West, Florida, 1940. It was a humid October afternoon when a neighbor tipped off the police. For years, rumors had swirled through the quiet, tropical town, whispers of strange music playing at night, of a pale, aging man dancing with a mysterious figure in the candlelight. Some claimed they had seen a woman's silhouette through the window of the dilapidated home on Flagler Avenue, though no one had entered or exited for years. But what the police would find inside, no one could have imagined. They knocked. The door creaked open, and inside they found 63-year-old Carl Tanzler, a former radiology technician and World War I veteran, sitting beside what appeared to be a mannequin. She was dressed in a tattered wedding gown. Her face was covered in wax and glass eyes. Her body, stiff and decayed, was adorned with silk and lace. But as investigators drew closer, the truth surfaced like a wave of rot. It wasn't a doll, it was a corpse. The body had once belonged to Maria Elena Milagro de Hoyos, known simply as Elena. She had died 9 years earlier, yet here she was lying in Carl Tanzler's bed, a grotesque sculpture of memory and obsession. Her bones held together with wire, her decomposed skin replaced with silk and wax. Her hair still styled, her eyes still open. Carl Tanzler had stolen her corpse from the cemetery and had been living with it for nearly a decade. But to understand how a respected man became one of the most morbid figures in American history, we must go back to the very beginning. To a man with a dream and a love that refused to die even when it should have. Carl Tanzler was born in 1877 in Dresden, Germany. From an early age, he was captivated by science, medicine, and fantasy. He claimed to have visions of a dark-haired woman who would become the love of his life. He believed she was shown to him by a long-dead ancestor, Countess Anna Constantia von Kosel, who guided him through dreams and omens. These visions, vivid and prophetic, stayed with him into adulthood. In 1926, Tanzler immigrated to the United States, settling in Zephyrhills, Florida. He was married and had children, but he left them behind shortly after arriving in Key West, where he took a job at the Marine Hospital. There, working as a radiology technician, he met her, Maria Elena Milagro de Hoyos. She was 21, he was 53. Elena was a Cuban-American beauty, vibrant, dark-haired, elegant. She had come to the hospital seeking treatment for tuberculosis, a disease that had already claimed much of her family. To Tanzler, she was the woman from his visions. He was convinced it was fate that the universe had finally delivered his long-awaited bride. From the moment he saw her, he became obsessed. Though Elena barely knew him, Tanzler began showering her with gifts. Jewelry, dresses, perfume. He wrote her passionate letters, professing undying love, calling her his destiny. He attempted experimental treatments, concocted medical elixirs, even brought a homemade electrical device to her bedside, believing he could cure her. Elena, by all accounts, was polite but distant. She never returned his affections. She never agreed to a relationship. But she was dying, and Tanzler was relentless. Despite his efforts, Elena succumbed to tuberculosis on October 25, 1931. Her family buried her in the Key West Cemetery, in a mausoleum paid for and secretly constructed by Tanzler himself. He obtained special permission to build the above-ground crypt and kept the only key. The family assumed it was a final act of kindness. They had no idea it was only the beginning. In the years that followed, Tanzler visited her tomb nearly every night. He claimed to speak with her ghost. He said her spirit called to him, begged him not to leave her alone in the cold darkness of the mausoleum. He began bringing flowers, music, candles. Then, after nearly 2 years of these nocturnal visits, he took the unthinkable next step. In April 1933, Carl Tanzler opened the mausoleum and stole Elena's body. He transported the corpse to his home in a makeshift toy wagon under the cover of night. What he found when he unwrapped her was what one would expect: decomposition, rot, decay. But to Tanzler, it wasn't repulsive, it was a challenge. Over the next several months, he began a painstaking process of preservation and reconstruction. Using wire hangers and piano strings, he reassembled her skeleton. He used mortician's wax to replace her decomposed flesh. Glass eyes were inserted into her skull. Her torso was stuffed with rags to maintain shape. A wig was made from her own hair, which her mother had previously given him as a keepsake. He dressed her in silk veils and jewelry. He kept her in bed, danced with her, slept beside her. Neighbors began to notice strange smells coming from the house. Others mentioned the music, the dancing, the shadows behind the curtains. But in the conservative culture of 1930s, Key West, no one dared pry too deeply. It wasn't until 1940, when Elena's sister confronted Tanzler after years of unease, that the truth was finally exposed. What police discovered shocked not just Florida, but the entire country. Newspapers couldn't get enough. Headlines screamed, "Man lives with girl's corpse, love beyond the grave, ghoul of Key West arrested." The story exploded into the national consciousness. But what surprised authorities even more than the crime was the reaction. Because not everyone was outraged. In fact, many were fascinated. When the public learned that Carl Tanzler had lived for nearly a decade with the corpse of a young woman, preserving her with wax and silk, speaking to her sleeping beside her, the natural response should have been horror. But that's not what happened. In 1940s, America fresh out of the Great Depression and on the cusp of World War II, the media was desperate for stories that could distract, shock, or seduce. And Carl Tanzler's macabre tale had it all: mystery, romance, obsession, and death. The newspapers didn't just report the crime, they sensationalized it. Some called it a love story beyond the grave. Others framed it as a tragic devotion, a misunderstood man who simply loved too much. Was it a crime of passion, one Florida headline asked, or the purest love the world has ever seen? Photographs of Tanzler and his bride, a disturbingly lifelike corpse, reconstructed with plaster and glass, were published nationwide. Editorials debated his sanity, but just as often praised his dedication. Women wrote to him in jail. Some offered to visit. Some sent love letters. One even proposed marriage. It was as though the public couldn't decide, was he a monster or a martyr of love? Legally, things were no less bizarre. Tanzler was arrested and charged with wantonly and maliciously destroying a grave and removing a body without authorization. The maximum penalty, a mere 3 years. But the case never even made it to trial. Why? Because the statute of limitations had expired. It had been more than 7 years since Elena Hoyos' body was removed from the mausoleum, and under Florida law, at the time, that meant he couldn't be prosecuted. Carl Tanzler walked free. Incredible, but true. A man who had dug up a body, taken it home, and lived with it in secret for 9 years, was never punished. But even more incredible than the legal failure was the public fascination. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse, not to protest, but to see him. To glimpse the man whose undying love had defied death. Journalists trailed him through the streets. Radio stations replayed the story for weeks. He was inexplicably a celebrity. Meanwhile, what happened to Elena's body? Even in death, even after death again, she was not allowed peace. After police recovered her remains from Tanzler's home, they were examined by pathologists and stored temporarily by local authorities. But the public clamored to see her, the girl who had been turned into a waxen bride. So, in an act of ghoulish spectacle, her body was put on public display at a local funeral home. Over 6,000 people came to see her. Some brought flowers, others brought cameras. All of them came to look not at a crime scene, but at a curiosity. Elena Hoyos had been objectified in life, fetishized in death, and now put on show like a macabre museum piece. Her story, her humanity, was overshadowed entirely by the narrative surrounding the man who violated her. Eventually, after several weeks of exhibition, authorities reburied Elena's remains in an unmarked grave in an undisclosed location. This time, they made sure Tanzler wouldn't find her. But by then, the damage had been done. And Tanzler, he returned to obscurity, but only barely. Now in his 60s, he moved to Zephyr Hills, Florida, where he lived alone in a small wooden shack. He never expressed remorse. He never apologized to Elena's family. In fact, he continued to speak about her, publicly calling her his eternal bride, insisting she had come to him in dreams, urging him to rescue her from the grave. He wrote articles. He granted interviews. He painted portraits of Elena. He even built a life-size effigy of her using a plaster death mask, which he reportedly slept beside until the day he died. To him, their love had never ended. To others, his delusion had never lifted. But the world had moved on. The war began. The headlines changed. and the strange little man with the corpse bride faded from the front pages into folklore. His story became legend, a tale told around campfires printed in true crime pulp magazines, whispered about in Key West for decades to come. But lost in the legend was Elena. She was not just a beautiful corpse. She was not a muse or a vision or a ghost in a wax mask. She was a woman born into poverty, struck by illness, and preyed upon in death by a man nearly 3 times her age, who imagined her not as she was, but as he wanted her to be. Carl Tanzler didn't love Elena. He possessed her, and in that act of possession, he revealed something darker than obsession. He revealed a kind of narcissism, so profound, so unchecked, that it consumed not just her body, but her story. And somehow the world let him. What kind of man steals a corpse, reconstructs it with wax and wire, and sleeps beside it for years? To understand Carl Tanzler's actions, we must enter a place darker than any mausoleum, the labyrinth of his own mind. Tanzler didn't see what he did as wrong, not ever. In interviews, in writings, in letters to the press, he described himself not as a criminal, but as a romantic. He believed he had saved Elena not from death, but from abandonment. He framed her grave as a prison. Her family, he said, had left her alone in the dark. He, on the other hand, had brought her into the light. This wasn't love. It was delusion. But to Tanzler, it was destiny. He had long claimed that visions had followed him since childhood, that he had seen the face of his one true love before ever meeting her, that a long-dead ancestor, Countess Anna Constantia von Kozel, had promised him a dark-haired beauty, a soulmate who would come to him in this lifetime. When he met Elena Hoyos in the Marine Hospital, he believed that prophecy had been fulfilled. But belief, when left unchecked, can become obsession. And Tanzler's obsession grew fast, invasive, and irreversible. He began projecting an entire identity onto Elena, one she never chose. In his mind, she wasn't just a patient. She was a bride, a damsel in distress, a figure from mythology, a character in a love story where only he could be the hero. He imagined that she loved him back, that she spoke to him from beyond the grave, that her soul hovered over his shoulder, begging to be with him again. And to make that fantasy real, he took her. This psychological state is known as erotomania, a rare delusional disorder in which an individual believes that another person, often a stranger or someone of higher status, is in love with them. Tanzler's erotomania merged with necrophilic fixation and a profound narcissism, forming a perfect storm of delusion. He wasn't just in love with Elena. He was in love with the idea of Elena, an image he had sculpted in his mind long before her death, and then horrifyingly sculpted again in flesh and wax. And this wasn't a man acting on sudden impulse. Tanzler's actions were meticulous. He preserved her body using mortician's wax, silk, cloth, wire, and perfume. He built contraptions to mask the odor of decomposition. He read medical journals to maintain the illusion of life. This was not the madness of chaos. This was the madness of control. Control over a woman who in life had rejected him. Control over a body that could no longer say no. Control over a narrative where he, not her, decided the ending. To the outside world, he was strange but harmless. His slight German accent, his frizzy white hair, his habit of speaking to invisible guests. He became known in Key West as the eccentric doctor, the quiet widower, the man who lived alone. But inside his home, he had built a mausoleum of fantasy. He celebrated birthdays for Elena, played music for her, served candle-lit dinners. He even attempted to restore her vocal cords, believing one day she would speak again. And in his writings, he insisted she did speak, not in sound, but in spirit. He was surrounded by her and entirely alone. But what truly unnerved psychologists wasn't just the necrophilia. It was his lack of guilt. When asked about his actions after his arrest, Tanzler showed no remorse. He didn't seem to understand why people were upset. He didn't hide from the accusations, he corrected them. "I didn't desecrate her," he once said. "I preserved her." He believed he was doing something sacred, an act of devotion, a victory over death. But in truth, it was a theft of dignity, of consent, of rest. And perhaps most disturbingly, his calmness made it all the more terrifying. Carl Tanzler didn't behave like a man caught in the grip of a manic episode. He didn't scream. He didn't cry. He spoke softly, gently, as if recounting a love story that the world simply didn't understand. He even wrote a memoir later in life where he described Elena not as a corpse, but as his resurrected bride. He included poems, drawings, pages upon pages of fantasy, dressed in the language of sentiment. It was a textbook case of pathological narcissism wrapped in spiritual delusion. And what makes it so dangerous, so disturbing, is how easily it could masquerade as romance. That's the trap Tanzler set not just for Elena, but for everyone who read his story. By cloaking horror in the language of love, he blurred lines that should never be blurred. Because love is not ownership. It is not obsession. It is not embalming a body and calling it destiny. It is consent. It is mutuality. It is letting go. But Tanzler never let go. He couldn't. And in that inability, he crossed into the realm of something far worse than insanity. He became a warning, a living example of what happens when fantasy replaces empathy, when delusion overrides morality, when a man convinces himself that what he wants is more important than what she deserved. Even in death, Elena was never free. In the years that followed Carl Tanzler's arrest and subsequent release, the world had a choice. It could confront the horror of what he had done, the theft of a young woman's body, the manipulation of her memory, and the transformation of her corpse into an object of personal obsession. Or it could tell itself a more palatable story, a love story, and disturbingly it chose the latter. Instead of rejecting Tanzler as a ghoul, the public began to recast him not as a criminal, but as a tragic romantic. Newspapers rebranded his actions as devotion. Radio hosts called it a strange, morbid passion. Even mainstream publications indulged in euphemisms, calling the act eccentric or unconventional, as though Tanzler's desecration of a corpse was merely the product of unrequited love gone too far. In 1947, the story took an even stranger turn when Carl Tanzler published an autobiographical article in Fantastic Adventures magazine titled The Secret of Elena's Tomb. Presented in serialized form, the story read like Gothic fiction. It wasn't a confession. It was a fantasy one where Tanzler was the noble, misunderstood protagonist, and Elena was the silent, grateful recipient of his eternal affection. The narrative conveniently skipped over details of bodily decay, psychological trauma, and the fact that Elena had never loved him. The magazine sold thousands of copies. Readers were divided. Some were horrified. Others, particularly women, sent fan letters. They praised his poetic style, his longing, his sorrow. A few said they envied Elena for being so adored. It was grotesque, and it raised a deeply uncomfortable truth about society's relationship with obsession-possession and the myth of male suffering as romantic. Carl Tanzler, after all, wasn't the first man to disguise entitlement as love, but he may have been the most literal. He didn't just stalk Elena in life. He took her in death. He didn't just fantasize about her. He physically shaped her body into the image he preferred. He removed her agency completely and called it devotion. But in the stories that emerged, Elena was rarely centered. She became background, a prop, a poetic ghost. The real story, the media suggested, was Tanzler's broken heart, not the body he violated. And that's where the damage multiplied. Because when society romanticizes madness, it invites repetition. When it sympathizes with obsession, it blurs consent. And when it turns ghouls into grieving lovers, it tells the next Carl Tanzler that maybe, just maybe, it's okay. The cultural mythologizing of Tanzler's love obscured the real horror of what had happened. And it exposed a larger pattern, a willingness to excuse extreme behavior when framed as emotionally driven. Especially when it came from an old man. Especially when the victim was a young woman. Tanzler, with his German accent and frail frame, didn't look dangerous. He looked like a character out of Gothic literature, someone who read poetry by candlelight, a man of science mourning a lost bride, the kind of figure we've been trained to forgive. And the public bought into that image. Hollywood eventually came knocking. Filmmakers explored adaptations. Horror anthologies borrowed the premise. Novels, stage plays, and podcasts all found fertile ground in the shocking but strangely sentimental tale of the corpse groom and his silent bride. But the stories almost never told Elena's side, because she never got one. Elena Hoyos was not a character. She was a real woman, 21 years old when she died. Vibrant, funny. From a hard-working Cuban-American family. She loved to dance. She liked music. She had dreams. She had options Tanzler refused to see. To him, she was an object, a prophecy, a symbol of fate. And in that failure to see her as fully human, he committed not just a crime of the body, but a crime of the soul. The same crime that culture repeated when it chose to paint him as a victim. It's easy to pity a man who loved too much. It's harder to admit when that love was one-sided, obsessive, and criminal. It's even harder when that man calls his crime devotion and the world agrees. The Carl Tanzler case became a mirror that revealed how easily stories can be twisted, how quickly discomfort can be softened by sentiment, how willingly we excuse horror when it wears the mask of longing. But no amount of poetry or perfume or wax can change what really happened. A woman died, and a man took her body for himself, and the world clapped. Carl Tanzler never went to prison. He never apologized. He never showed remorse. And after the headlines faded and the tourists stopped gawking at his waxen bride, he simply went home, but not to Key West. Tanzler retreated inland to the sleepy rural town of Zephyr Hills, Florida. A quiet place with dusty roads and citrus groves. A town far removed from the sensationalism of his past. There he lived in a small wooden shack provided by a sympathetic friend. He had no wife, no children with him, no job, no status. But he had his delusion. And he wasn't done with Elena. With her real body buried in a secret unmarked grave by officials in Key West, finally out of his reach, Tanzler did the unthinkable. He built a new one, using a plaster death mask, wigs, glass eyes, wire and wax. Tanzler reconstructed a life-size effigy of Elena. He dressed it in bridal gowns. He called it by her name. And by all accounts, he lived with this figure exactly as he had lived with her corpse, feeding it, speaking to it, sleeping beside it. He didn't hide it. Visitors to his shack, rare though they were, often noted the doll-like woman sitting in the corner or resting on the bed. He would introduce her casually as my wife. Sometimes, if asked, he would show them drawings or read from one of the hundreds of letters he claimed to still write to Elena's spirit. This wasn't merely nostalgia. It was possession prolonged. Carl Tanzler's home had become a shrine not to a memory, but to a manufactured fantasy. One that he controlled completely. One in which Elena never died, never said no, never left him. In this tiny house, time stood still. No phone, no radio, just journals, sketches, wax, and silence. He wrote constantly rambling memoirs, poems, medical theories, and love letters that blended science fiction, mysticism, and obsession into one long, unbroken hallucination. He believed Elena visited him in spirit, that her soul guided his hand, that she was pleased with what he had made. These weren't just private thoughts. He published them in self-funded pamphlets, in letters to editors, in the bizarre article for Fantastic Adventures, where he presented his grave robbing not as perversion, but as resurrection. He insisted until his death that the real crime was the world separating them. He even claimed with complete conviction that he had once constructed an airship to carry Elena's body into the stratosphere, where radiation from cosmic rays would restore her to life. It sounds like madness. And it was. But Tanzler believed it, not symbolically, literally. He died with blueprints of this resurrection vessel in his notebook, scribbled in pencil, complete with propulsion systems and incubation chambers. His pseudoscientific ramblings were the language of a man who refused to let go, who could not accept that death had limits, who believed love gave him the right to override reality. In his final years, Carl Tanzler was rarely seen in public. He became a myth in Zephyr Hills, the strange German widower who lived with a statue. Most locals avoided him. Some pitied him. A few still saw him as a tragic figure. But behind the closed doors of his shack, the truth was far more grotesque. He had not changed. He had not healed. He had simply replaced the corpse with a copy. And in doing so, he proved that what drove him was never about Elena. It was about control, about constructing a world where no one left him, where he was always the center, where reality bent to the will of his obsession. It was delusion weaponized, and yet through it all, Tanzler saw himself as the victim, not Elena, not her family, not the community he shocked and violated, him. In a letter written just months before his death, he wrote, "They took her from me, but I never let go. I carried her spirit in my arms, in my bed, in my heart. She was always mine." He signed it as he always did, Count Carl von Cosel. Even at the end, he clung to the noble title he had bestowed upon himself, a fabrication just like the rest of his mythology. He wasn't a count. He wasn't a doctor. He wasn't a hero. He was a man who rewrote reality to suit his fantasy. And in the quiet of his final years, no one stopped him. No prison, no court, no judgment, just silence and the soft hum of delusion echoing through a shack filled with waxwire and the ghost of a girl who never loved him. Carl Tanzler died alone. It was July 3rd, 1952, a humid summer morning in Zephyr Hills, Florida. A neighbor noticed that the lights in his shack had remained off for several days. When they finally forced open the door, they found him lying on the floor near the bed, the same bed where for years he had kept the effigy of Elena Hoyos. The effigy was still there. Though time had dulled the colors and cracked the wax, Tanzler had continued to maintain it as best he could. He had combed its hair, adjusted its dress, lit candles at its feet. When authorities examined the scene, they described it as a shrine to a ghost, a room where time had stopped in 1931 and never resumed. On a nearby table lay letters. Some were addressed to Eleanor, others to God. Many were illegible, covered in dense cursive crossing over itself like a web of thought that refused to end. In his last note, Tanzler wrote, "Soon, my darling, we shall be reunited beyond this earthly pain, where no court can part us, where no law can find us, where your smile is not a memory but light." It wasn't a suicide note. It was a love letter to death. But what haunted investigators most was what they found in the footlocker near his bed. Wrapped in a faded sheet, hidden beneath his journals and drawings, was what appeared to be a replica death mask. Plaster, carefully painted, with glass eyes and delicate lashes glued in place. Some say it was a new attempt at a second sculpture of Elena. Others believe it was part of the original effigy, or worse, that it was cast directly from her corpse before he was caught. No one knows for sure. What they did know, however, was that even in death, Tanzler remained consumed by her. Not by who she was, but by who he had made her to be. His funeral was small. No procession, no mourning crowd. No family members came forward to claim the body. He was buried quietly in a local cemetery far from Key West, far from the girl he had spent his life chasing, possessing, and rewriting. But Carl Tanzler's story didn't end with his burial. In fact, it was just beginning. Within months, his tale resurfaced in pulp magazines, true crime serials, radio specials. By the 1960s, he had become a myth, part horror, part tragedy, all spectacle. The story spread: the old man who robbed a grave, the doctor who danced with the dead, the lover who wouldn't let go. Writers couldn't resist the symmetry, the gothic overtones, the themes of death and desire, science and madness, love and decay. But the retellings often blurred the truth. They trimmed the horror, softened the details, painted Tanzler as eccentric rather than exploitative, romantic rather than repulsive. It was easier that way, more entertaining, more consumable. In many versions, Elena didn't matter at all. She became a silhouette, a symbol, a nameless muse whose only purpose was to be longed for, worshipped, taken. And that's where the tragedy metastasized. Because Tanzler wasn't just a man who failed to see Elena as human, he was a symbol of a culture that rewarded men for obsession and erased women in the process. The wax, the wigs, the bridal gowns, they weren't signs of love. They were props in a performance where only one character had a voice. And long after Tanzler's death, that performance continued. Newspaper retrospectives revisited the case every Halloween. Podcasts rehashed it with eerie sound effects and somber narration. Television specials dramatized it with actors and makeup and dim lighting, always emphasizing his pain, rarely hers. Even tourists in Key West asked where the crypt had been, where the love story took place. Few asked about the Hoyos family. Fewer still remembered the real Elena. Because Tanzler had succeeded not just in violating her body, but in replacing her story with his own. And the world let him. Long after Carl Tanzler's body returned to the ground, his story continued to haunt the air. It lingered not because people wanted justice, but because they wanted entertainment. True crime readers devoured it. Tabloids sensationalized it. TV specials aired reenactments with dramatic voiceovers, candlelit scenes, and eerie string music. The story was always the same: the eccentric old doctor who loved too much, the poor man with a broken heart. the misunderstood genius whose only crime was not letting go. It was a convenient narrative and a deeply dishonest one, because the real legacy of Carl Tanzler wasn't about passion. It was about power, and how easily power can be dressed in poetry. Carl Tanzler didn't just desecrate a corpse. He violated a woman's memory. He weaponized grief. He convinced himself and much of the public that his desires mattered more than her dignity. That love meant possession. That obsession was romantic. That death meant nothing if he refused to accept it. And somehow for decades no one challenged that. The broader culture rewarded him, turned his delusions into headlines, made him a tragic figure instead of a cautionary one. And in doing so, it revealed something far darker. A willingness to ignore horror if it's wrapped in longing. This phenomenon isn't new. Across history and media, there's been a pattern. Men who stalk, control, or harm women are too often framed as heartbroken, passionate, or simply misunderstood. Their pain is elevated. Their victims are erased. Tanzler's story was just an early grotesque example, because even today, the same tropes appear. In romance films, in pop songs, in nice guy narratives where persistence is praised and rejection is vilified, where obsession is called loyalty, where can't live without her becomes a cultural punchline, not a red flag. Carl Tanzler may have died in 1952, but the lie he helped popularize that love justifies control is very much alive. What makes Tanzler's case uniquely disturbing is its symbolic clarity. Every action he took was a metaphor made real. When he ignored Elena's wishes in life, he reflected the entitlement of countless men who believe affection should be rewarded. When he stole her body, he revealed the extreme endpoint of seeing women as possessions. When he preserved and posed her corpse, he exposed the horror of turning memory into a performance one where the dead can't protest. And when society gave him sympathy, it confirmed how easily charm can camouflage cruelty. There's also something chilling in how ordinary he seemed. Carl Tanzler didn't look like a monster. He looked like someone's grandfather. He used polite language. He wrote poetry. He dressed well. He quoted science and philosophy. He wasn't violent in the traditional sense. He didn't yell or threaten. But his violence was deeper, the slow, creeping kind that seeps into the spaces we don't guard. The kind that rewrites a woman's legacy, that reanimates a body without permission, that speaks to a doll and calls it love. That's why this story endures. Not because of its shock value, but because of what it reveals about us, our discomfort, our complicity, our collective failure to ask the hard questions. Why do we sympathize with predators if they appear romantic? Why do we mourn the man who took instead of the woman who lost everything? Why do we let the story end when the man dies? And never tell what became of the family he left broken. The Hoyos family never recovered. Elena's mother lived for years after the scandal, reportedly never speaking of it again. Her sisters, shamed and horrified, moved on in silence. Her final resting place remains unmarked. Its location kept secret to this day out of fear that Tanzler's followers or morbid tourists might disturb it again. Even in death, Elena had to be protected. Not from time, but from fascination, and yet the world still stares. There are books, articles, a wax figure at Ripley's Believe It or Not museum, podcasts with titles like Deadly Devotion and Love Beyond the Grave. You can find t-shirts with Carl Tanzler's face on them, coffee mugs with quotes from his letters, internet threads where users debate whether what he did was true love or madness as if there were a question. This is not how we treat crimes. This is how we treat myths. But myths, if left unchecked, become templates. And Tanzler's story, repackaged again and again, risks becoming not a warning but a blueprint. A blueprint for obsession. A blueprint for entitlement. A blueprint for saying, if I love her enough, the rules don't apply. And for that reason alone, the truth must be told unromanticized, unsoftened, and unafraid. Because Elena Hoyos deserved better, not just in life, but in how we remember her. Carl Tanzler died believing he was a romantic hero. To the very end, he clung to his illusion that he had rescued Elena Hoyos from death, that he had preserved her with dignity, that his obsession was justified by a love that transcended life itself. But that was the story he told. And for too long it was the only one the world listened to. Because it's easier to believe in the fantasy than face the grotesque truth that a young woman already silenced by illness was silenced again in death. That her memory was twisted into something she never chose. that a man's obsession became a cultural curiosity instead of a crime. In life, Elena Hoyos was a vibrant, joyful part of a close-knit Cuban-American family in Key West. She wanted to live. She fought tuberculosis with courage. She never loved Carl Tanzler, never asked for his visits, never agreed to be his bride. And when she died at 21, she was supposed to be laid to rest in peace. But peace was not what she got. Because even in her coffin, Elena became a canvas for Tanzler's delusions, for society's morbid curiosity, and for the countless retellings that erased her voice. So now let us remember her not as a prop in a strange love story, but as a person. Let us remember that consent does not die with the body, that love without autonomy becomes possession, that grief unchecked by reality can rot into obsession. Carl Tanzler wasn't just a man in mourning. He was a man who refused to accept boundaries, legal, ethical, human. A man who used science to mask madness, who used poetry to justify predation, who used mourning to mask manipulation. And perhaps worst of all, he was indulged by the press, by the courts, by a public eager to see something romantic in something horrific. Because there's a reason this story refuses to die. It's not just the shock. It's not just the strangeness. It's the mirror it holds up to us, to how easily we confuse persistence with love, to how quickly we forgive men who hurt women in the name of devotion, to how often we turn real harm into entertainment, myth, or meme. But the myth is not the legacy. The legacy is what we choose to do with the truth. And the truth is this: Carl Tanzler didn't love Elena Hoyos. He claimed her. He rewrote her. He took from her the only thing she had left: the right to be still, to be remembered honestly, to be human. And when he was done, we made him famous for it. So, if there's a lesson here, a final chapter in this grotesque tale, it is not about undying love. It's about what happens when obsession is romanticized, and when silence becomes complicity. Elena deserves more than whispers. She deserves more than legend. She deserves to be the center of her own story. So the next time this tale is told on a podcast, in a tabloid, through late-night whispers on the internet, let it be told differently. Let it be told truthfully. Let it be told with her name first. Maria Elena Milagro de Hoyos. A daughter, a sister, a woman. Not a corpse, not a bride, not a trophy, and not his.